Hello, everyone. Welcome to another installment of the GoMobi.work coaching series. Each week, we're bringing you a topic in coaching and performance development for your team so that you can create the most empowering, fulfilling, and high-performing work environment that you can with your group. So my name is Wade Bruffy, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of GoMobi.work. And as always, I'm joined by my wonderful co-founder, Zoltan Sarda.
Hey everyone, good to see you all again. Really looking forward to today's talk. And with that, let's get started, Wade.
Great. Thanks, Zoltan. I'm just going to resize our screen here so that everybody watching this on the recording doesn't have, you can see both. There we go. Okay, we're ready. So our topic this week is something that we like to talk about a lot. And Zoltan and I, we nerd out on a lot of things, and this is one of our favorites to talk about, not only between ourselves, but of course with our clients, because this is something that's very important. And it's, if you do it right, it is exceptionally powerful in helping people understand where they need to go, how they can get better, and ultimately the reward that they get from that is huge internally and for your business. So what we're going to be talking about today is what counts as evidence in demonstrating our growth. So we call these artifacts. So we're going to be talking about artifacts of growth today.
Okay. And so today, like this concept of why artifacts, and I think sometimes people refer to this as data, but we really think of it, artifacts, as what is it that we can look at in a variety of ways that tell a story of growth and development. And so these three goals around the artifacts are really aligned with everything that we've been talking about in all of these meetings. Number one is, how do we put the employees in the driver's seat of their own professional learning? So how are we giving them autonomy? How are we giving them agency, rather than having them be sort of passive recipients of, here's what you should be doing, getting them to push that forward. How can we really bring in real tangible illustrations of where they are in terms of their growth and where they are in terms of what they need? So this idea that an employee is going to say, hey, here's how I'm growing, here's what I'm doing well, and here's the areas that I'm still needing support, I'm still needing some new knowledge or skill development. And then, as we talked about in every one of these sessions, this idea of how do we bring inquiry and curiosity-based learning into what we're doing. Those pieces are really critical in terms of keeping an open, creative, mind that really allows us to explore a variety of ways of thinking about our growth and development.
Fantastic. And, maybe it's a little bit obvious to say, but we wanted to start off by saying that in and of itself, growth is invisible. Unless you've been hitting the gym a bunch and maybe you're getting physically larger and that's what you're considering growth, and that's a great thing to do, you're not going to see somebody's personal or professional development on the outside. So we have to look to the products of their work. So what are these artifacts of performance that are tangible demonstrations of growth and movement towards our goals, our development plans, and ultimately where we would like to get to as we grow as a professional and as a person. So we need to look to the evidence of that instead of looking for it with our eyes.
And I might even say, Wade, that the artifact of going to the gym is the muscles that you see on the outside.
Yes,
but actually the
absolutely.
growth, it's all the invisible stuff. It's like, your blood pressure is better. You've got all these other things that can't be seen without some kind of artifact, right?
Yeah, that's a great example. So a story from the business world, from our team. I used to work for a medical device company, and I was on the strategic partnerships team. I was a founding member of that team. And one of the things that we did really well was set ourselves up with a sense of artifacts that we were trying to gather as we built this team from nothing. So to give you a little bit of background, the strategic partnerships team that I was working on was building partnerships to commercialize a integrated product. So giving our technology and licensing it to another system so that they could make it a part of their surface, their offering, and people who are the end users would access it through their platform, use our tool, but connect it to their system. So the idea there is to enhance the clinician's ability to provide care wherever they are, and to make that user experience the best in class experience, which is what we had built. But we wanted to make it available on every device, not just a device that we had set up with our system, because there's a lot of pre-existing stuff in a hospital. And instead of having to reinvent the wheel, why not just make our service play nicely with some of the other stuff out there, so we can dramatically increase our reach and also help the doctors and nurses provide better care. So we knew from the beginning that we needed to decide what matters most and stay focused on that, because this is a big project. It's a multi-year project, and we needed to know what are the specific things that we're going to know that this is, how are we going to know that this is successful? So the number one thing that we did, and this was super powerful for our team, and Zoltan and I do this with our clients all the time, is we established a set of guiding principles. So this is, what are the things that we need to do in order that we believe that we need to do, even though we've never done this before? What are some of the key tenets of what we believe a great product looks like? And so how can we practice those things in the decisions that we make about what we're building? So some of the ones that we came up with our team were that we wanted the integration itself, the actual SDK, the software development kit, to be very easy to use and for it to be easy to update and maintain it. The software is constantly being updated, so it needs to get taken care of. Another one was that we wanted for our users for that to be really easy for them to understand and fit into an existing workflow. There's all sorts of different things happening that your provider is doing in this section that they're spending with you. And then finally, for the business end, we wanted it to be a mutual financial success for every partner, every opportunity that we had worked on together. And so those guiding principles were helpful for us as we made decisions about what to do. Now, what we were looking at as these projects were underway were some of these artifacts. So what we did was we looked at quantitative and qualitative artifacts. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what this looks like for your team and how you can use it. But some of the things that we did for the qualitative were to look at feedback from the engineering team. How easy was this? Another thing was to talk to the providers that were using the tool and ask them, what kind of use cases were you using this for in the hospital? Maybe there was something that we didn't account for, something that we could improve on if it's a very prevalent use case. But one thing that was really interesting that we found out from the quantitative data is that we were looking at the average number of weeks to complete the software integration process. And what we found is, despite the fact that we had standardized everything on our end to meet our guiding principle that it's easy to update, is that different companies that would take the software themselves had different ability levels within their business to implement the integration. So people, we even would have to maybe even work with an outside service provider because the company's internal team had never encountered this particular programming language before. So there are different things, and we found out that maybe some businesses aren't as qualified because we're trying to meet this goal of making it really easy, and part of that is reducing this implementation time as much as we can. So that was a really interesting thing that we did. You can see a couple other examples here, but we wanted to start off with that story and that example because it really illustrates something that we felt like we did well and that led to good results for the business.
And I think this is, to me, what you just described, Wade, was a story of your past experience, but you were also talking about the story that the artifacts were telling. So like that idea of, you had an artifact about that integration, the duration that it took to get integration started, and you had other pieces of artifacts of information from understanding how the client's context was, right? And so those artifacts told a story of this piece. And we're going to go now, and this is a key part of this work of really bringing in the idea of using artifacts is that the artifacts can actually tell the story of growth and progress. And there's a lot of research into how storytelling actually, we learn from stories. If you think about little kids in school with their parents, they're listening, we're telling them stories all the time. We make sense of our experience through telling a story in our head. And so the more we can kind of have ways of telling a story about something, the more they really stick. So this Gary Klein was a researcher, and he talked a lot about how stories are used in a teaching or coaching tools. He said that they can illustrate causal relationships that might not be seen elsewhere, or they can provide background context to help us make more sense. Gary Klein's work was really highlighted in the book Made to Stick, which is one of our favorites. And then even on the Wharton School of Business website, they have this information for teachers in their program to use stories with their students. And I like this one, that the stories are signposts of our experiences. And again, echoing Gary Klein's work, they make sense of what we know, and they create this continuity. They help us see things in a kind of a narrative sense, which is really helpful. So again, why stories? And this is key, going back to what we said before. How do we keep employees in a place of curiosity, and how do we keep them in a place of inquiry? Because that's where growth is going to happen, rather than being that passive recipient of information and coaching. How do we put them so that they're driving the inquiry, they're driving the curiosity? But a story allows them, if they're telling a story, if they're telling their own story, it allows them to stay in this informal place. It decreases the evaluative aspect. It's less consequential in some ways while they're engaged in that storytelling piece. And all of that creates more openness, more creativity, and an expansive view. And this is exactly what we want. If we have employees that we're working with, and we want them to make connections about how is what I'm doing today related to my goals, and what can I do next? This requires this openness and this open space and this bigger view of the world. And a lot of this comes from one of my favorite sort of experiments was done in the 40s, and Daniel Pink highlighted it in his book Drive. There's a lot of different, this experiment has been brought up in many different ways, but I think it illustrates sort of that idea of how do you keep things from being overly consequential, which can limit that sort of expansive view. And so this was this candle experiment. They would show, they would take groups of people and they'd show them this picture. You have a book of matches, a box of thumbtacks, and a candle. And they'd say, so that your task is, as quickly as possible, figure out a way to attach the candle to the wall with what you've got here and light that candle. Everybody gets the answer to this within some period of time. And the idea is you empty the tacks out of the box, you stick the box to the wall, and you put the candle in it. But what they did was they took two different kinds of groups of people, they did two different things with their different groups. One of them is just solve the problem. Just here's the picture, how would you solve the problem? Other people, they said, we'll pay you $10 or $20 or whatever it was if you solve the problem. Or we're going to evaluate how you solve the problem. There's some kind of consequence to their performance. And what they found was the people who they just said just solve the problem were much faster in solving this thing. And when they realized this, there's this concept. It's a creativity and sort of perspective concept involved in this, where you have to be able to change this idea of object permanence. So you have to change your conception of what each of the objects was. So you have to think of the box as, I can dump the thumbtacks out of the box and use it as something else. It's not a thumbtack holder anymore, it's now a candle holder. It's simple, but that takes like this expansive ability. And the key to this is that when there's a consequence behind it, people's focus gets narrow. It's almost like we put blinders on them. They'll eventually see it, but it's going to take longer. And probably the solution in other more complicated cases is not going to be as useful as if they had a much more expansive view. So the question is, how can we keep them in that space? And so again, going back to this idea, they're telling the story. It's keeping them in that inconsequential space, that sort of informal space. They're really looking at describing what's going on. And so the structure of a coaching story, in some ways, an ideal structure is tell the story of what happened. Look at these artifacts. How can you explain what happened by these artifacts that you're choosing? And what part of the story here is, what are the motivations and thoughts and conflicts and successes of the people that were involved? That's part of any good story. And so let's just tell that story. Keep pointing, what are these artifacts telling us about these pieces? And so then also, story also has the destination. So how does what's happening here in these artifacts relate to where we're going, where the ultimate destination is for this piece? And so this, if we can keep this sort of structure in mind as we're guiding people through telling the story around their artifacts. And again, here's kind of this structure in how this story could go. I'm looking at the artifacts and I might be saying, so at this moment here, this is what I was thinking, this is what I was doing, this is what I was feeling. And then looking at some other artifact, and here's what happened, here's what the outcome of that was. And I can tell that story. Then the next piece is, okay, so now we know what happened here, what the outcome of that was, but how does that relate to where you're going? And that's another part of the story. And Wade's going to get into that in just a moment. But
Zoltan, one of the things I love about this sentence is that it's linking the internal state with the external result. And I think that's something that it's so easy to not do. We spend so much time focus on the minutiae of the external thing, and we forget to acknowledge how my personal thoughts, feelings, and maybe behaviors is more common, but thoughts and feelings are such a important part of determining what our behavior is. So I think that's a really powerful sentence.
Yeah, I totally agree, because that's the context, right? That's the continuity. That's how you're pulling things together through this. And I think, to your point, like if you go back here, the minutia is often what we focus on. So again, a useful set of artifacts. There are multiple perspectives, but I think when you were talking about the minutia, often minutia is found in the quantitative data. Yeah. It's like, that's the graphs, charts, all those numbers. And yeah, I would say that traditional forms of sort of employee development, the huge emphasis is on this work, is on this kind of artifact. Whereas, how can we get what you're talking about, bringing in those, what's going on internally for the person? That's the qualitative pieces. So again, thinking about what are, and Wade, in your story earlier, you had these sort of sets of artifacts that you had, which I thought were really interesting in terms of how that project was laying out. But again, quantitative, or anything that can be shown with basically a graph or a chart of some kind, sales numbers, productivity, NPS scores, error rates, any of those things that we're looking at, versus the qualitative and descriptive. I might bring in a video of myself or an audio recording of something, or I might bring in a series of emails that I've had with a client or with a team member, or, let's look at the client feedback that we're getting, or my own reflections on what's happening. I also think some of the, like, how did this process lay out? Like, draw a picture of what happened. That's a great artifact. Just draw a sketch of, here's what happened in the last week, or in how this thing rolled out that we're getting coaching on.
And
then
picking the right things in regard for that too. Like you don't want to track the wrong thing. You have to, that's something to be really conscientious of, is which one of these things is going to help us get to the causal. We're going to be talking about that in a later weekly coaching video, but this is something that we've been talking a lot about lately.
Absolutely, because you were looking at, so in yours, you were really, part of your feedback, your descriptive feedback was obviously feedback from the client, right? You had sort of the numbers on how quickly this was rolling out, but then part of that was how is it landing on the client that helps you understand those numbers a little bit more.
Yep, absolutely.
And then again, I think that part of keeping it open, keeping the focus on the artifacts and how the artifacts tells the story, rather than what did, sort of dialing in on the employee and what are they, what are they doing? It keeps them in that space of informality. It keeps them in that space of openness. And then later we can sort of say, okay, when we get to the goals, and say, okay, now what are you going to do now that we've sort of talked about this piece?
Yeah, right. I love it. And the prerequisite to all of this is shared agreement. And so the reason that we have to, first of all, make sure that we establish what agreements we want to agree on. And so outlining those, which we'll talk about in a second, but then also getting that confirmation that everybody is on board. One thing that we do, which is a symbolic way of doing this, is that when we help a company, one of our customers, develop a coaching protocol, we ask everybody in their business to print out a copy of the coaching protocol and sign it. And if we develop a set of guiding principles for a team or a business, we make sure that when that document is finalized, and of course it never really is finalized, it's a living document, but when we get to a place where we're saying this is finished for now, everybody prints that out and they sign off on it. So one of the ways that we create agreements is at the beginning of something. We want to set that up so that we are able to be on equal terms and everybody's on the same page. I thought of an example of this, which would be maybe even a job description. A job description is an example of a shared agreement. If you read a job description and you apply for that job, what you are inherently saying is, I agree that I believe that I can meet these qualifications for these requirements. And what the business is saying back to you as the applicant is, this is what will be asked of you. If you aren't comfortable with these requirements, don't apply for this role, because this is what we need somebody to do if we're going to choose you for this position. And so
how often does your job description come into your coaching sessions after you've been hired, right?
Not nearly enough. Yes. And at a high performing organization, frequently, they're always measuring that. But in a lot of places, not enough. And the idea here is that, in a job description, maybe even, I love this example because your job description may change over time. The needs that the business has for the person in your role, the scope of that may change. And so that's what we mean when we say these are living documents, and they need to be updated to keep them appropriate and current and helpful. Because if they're out of date, they cease to become helpful, and perhaps they can even lead to misalignment and missed communication and let down. Because if people are expecting one thing and they get something else, there's going to be all kinds of confusion. Go back and watch our video on alignment if you want more information on this. So one way that these agreements can be powerfully used is an agreements of what excellence and success look like. So this is what, when we work with a customer and help them with their guiding principles, this as part of our onboarding process, we talk about, what does this mean to you? Like when I take this thing that we're thinking about as what excellence looks like, what does that look like for you? If you were saying excellence for our team looks like outstanding customer service. Okay, so my idea of what outstanding customer service might look like could be different from what Zoltan's looks like. Could be different from what yours looks like. So we need to be bringing these in. So we look at these instances, which we call exemplars. And that's an example that Zoltan brings from the education world, is what an exemplar is: something that is demonstrating excellence in some given aspect, or as a project or as a piece of work. This is what excellence looks like. And we were wanting to say, what makes this exemplary and why does it make it exemplary? Why do these particular qualities mean that it's successful? And once we understand that, we can understand what principles we can take away if we're trying to inform somebody else. This is what you ought to be doing if you want to produce an example that lives up to this standard, this exemplar. So it helps inform our future work. And if we've never done this before, like in my example from before, we need to be making our best approximation of what success will look like, because then we are working together. We have an idea of these are our priorities, keeps us aligned as we venture out into something unknown. And once again, I don't think this can be said enough. Without agreement, nothing happens. So that's why we need to, whether it's, and really it should be explicit, but if you're gathering this explicit agreement, we agree that this is what we're going to do. And there will be sometimes there's an Amazon value, which I really love, and that's disagree and commit. So even if there isn't agreement, somebody needs to agree that they are outvoted, or we're going to try it this way, even if it's 1-1, and somebody eventually needs to say, we're going to do it this way, and we're going to do it this way. And even if it's the wrong way, we're going to do it the best we can. And that is an Amazon functional value. And I love that example because you can see all the different projects that they've tried. And so finally, just to really bring this home, is the idea is that we're getting sign-on here. And so in order to get sign-on from everybody, which is how these are going to work, we need everybody to agree in some way, because without that, the team won't work well together. We need to include everyone's perspective. And so with bringing in these multiple perspectives from each person on the team, because everybody's going to see something differently, that is exceptionally valuable to have all these different ways of viewing things. So think about it from the perspective of, we're trying to paint the clearest picture we possibly can. So we need to include as many voices as possible. So just to explain, I brought up a few of these new terms. So we have this idea of an exemplar and an artifact. So I wanted to bring in just a quick diagram for you all to understand a little bit how this flows together. So we have the coachee first. And Zoltan, if you press the next arrow key, you'll see a little caption that I put here. So when we coach our customers on how to start to collect artifacts, we always say that they should triangulate them. So try to bring in 3 pieces of evidence to a coaching session that you think are a case in point. So on the other side, we have this exemplar. And so this is what the coach is really bringing forward. The coach needs to have this understanding of, a really deep understanding of, what does excellence look like? So the coach is the steward of the exemplar, and their job is to help meet the employee in the middle so that they can start to produce work that is going along this continuum and really embodying the exemplary work. So making our work product as close to the example as possible. And so when we bring an artifact, we bring it forward and say, what does this show me? How is this an example? And an exemplar is saying, this is why this is this is exemplary. And in the middle, we're saying, how do we know that these things are meeting each other? So the idea with it, how do we know it, is looking at the effects. So like, what kinds of practices went into this that make it excellent, and what kind of practices, and how can we tell, like, what are the demonstrations, the artifacts, the proof that these are leading to the kind of excellence that we're after. So, and this is all in the middle here, is all about agreement, because we need to have agreement on how we know that this exemplar is exemplary. We need to have agreement on how we're going to measure the artifacts that are coming into this session. So we need to know that there's overlap. And so that's why we put this in the bubble of agreement.
And I love that. No, I love the diagram, because it's also like, so I'm the person being coached. I bring my artifacts. We have these exemplary artifacts, and then my process in the middle is going to get my artifacts more in line with those exemplary ones, right, through that process. I think that's just a great thing to keep in mind here.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we have an exercise for you, as we like to end these with exercises. Now, we want you to go into your next meeting and we want you to identify a growth area for each one of your reports. And this can be something that is new to them. It can be something that they've been working on for a while. The idea is that you're going to let them know, I'm going to give you we're going to try something new so I can better support you in achieving this growth goal that you have. And so we want you to then ask them to, over the next couple of weeks, to bring in to collect some qualitative and quantitative artifacts that they can then bring to the next session that will demonstrate some of their growth. And we want you to ask them these questions in that session after they've collected the artifacts. How do these artifacts show us what was happening? How do they describe what you are thinking, feeling, and doing? And how do they demonstrate the result? And how do these artifacts compare to the exemplars that reflect reaching your goals? And what are your next steps to make sure that you're going in this direction? So we have a little bit of reflective questions in here. We have a little bit of action questions in here, but the idea is to get your team used to using the practice of gathering artifacts as a tool to turbocharge your employees' professional growth. Because if you're helping them to understand what is this showing us, it's this really analysis of the work product that is going to help them understand what needs to be improved in the future. So it's creating a little bit more of a tangible feedback structure. And we've talked about feedback in a previous video as well. So if you are interested in that, go back and watch that video. It's on our YouTube channel or on our LinkedIn. But you get the idea here that the point of collecting an artifact is to demonstrate something. And so we want to first establish those agreements. We want to develop collect the artifacts and then use those artifacts and prompt our person who's reporting to us to tell us the story of these artifacts, because that's going to help them grow.
Absolutely.
All right, everyone. Thanks again for another great session.
Thanks, everybody. Again, as always, if this is useful, we'd love to hear that input. If you have thoughts or additions to this, we'd love to hear that input. Again, all of this work for people engaged in this complicated work of developing people, it really needs a lot of collaboration, a lot of shared ideas. We hope this has been helpful. We'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Thanks, everyone. See you in next week.